what I consider as the most important points to bear in mind in regard to the subject of ministry. So it is quite possible that the items that I bring up here will also be the subject of the questions for the oral exams. So please pay attention, therefore, to how I explain every item here, because I think this might be helpful for you in trying to answer some of the questions that I will be asking. They're general enough to be able to to make you understand what we are about, but at the same time, the general statement would imply many other details that I would like you to be able to fill up by your readings, your previous readings from the past several months, as well as the part of the lecture that we spoke about. A section of the oral exams will have to do with history. That's very important. I always put emphasis on historical development of the matter of ministry. And also I put a great deal of importance in the theology of ministry. What the more practical aspects, of course, is something that is also equally important, but these things are probably more familiar. Okay. So I have several statements here that I would like to use as my what I would call different theses in regard to the ministry in the church, or ministries in the church. The world today needs the ministry offered by the church. A second thesis would be the ministry. That ministry is the outflow of Christian discipleship. Its connection to Christian discipleship. Third, the very fundament of ministry is the mission of the triune God, Jesus the Christ, and the church as the sacrament of God's presence today. I will explain each of these a little later. Ministry is the responsibility of all, but in varying degrees and levels. Ministry is for building up the ecclesial and human community. Because the world is constantly changing, the church's ministry has to adapt itself accordingly. Okay. And I use, of course, the model of Christ and the figure of Christ washing the feet of his disciples, in my opinion, is probably the most beautiful icon to remember when we talk about ministry. What it is all about. We participating in the ministry of Christ, but Christ himself showing us how ministry is done. Okay. All right. The world today needs the kind of ministry that the church offers. For me, the first step in talking about ministry is to look at the reality of the world today. Because I think this is one or the only way we can seek to bring the message of Jesus to the world today. That if we look at the ministries of the world today, then we will be convinced more than ever that the church is needed, especially the ministry according to the way of Jesus is much, much needed in today's world. As you have already seen, the idea of the community pantry, for example. It's a beautiful, appreciated all over the world. And there's a video that talks in the Philippines and being copied in many different parts of the world. But that is really the kind of thing that is very consistent with what the church is supposed to be doing. So I'm glad in a way that this has taken place here in the Philippines, but it's something that is at the very heart of our identity as Christians. So The first step, always look at what the world needs today. Just as the good shepherd always looks at the needs of the sheep. What does this do? This makes the ensuing ministry rooted in real and current experiences of people today, not imagined issues or concerns that no longer are as important today as they were perhaps in the past. Okay, so being realistic. You talk about current situation. COVID-19 is a very, very current situation. But at the same time, the concerns of people with regard to COVID-19 and even the realizations that people have in regard to what have brought them together is uh, something that is very, very real, but it's something that also the church has responded to since since its very beginnings, the very beginning of the church. Okay, so uh, by the way, I don't know whether you notice some of the advertisements, advertisements, for example, of Jollibee. I'm not an endorser of Jollibee, but other advertisements I found in regard to COVID, for example. There's this one advertisement about Jollibee. I mean, of Jollibee, I think, in regard to a grandfather talking about the experience of COVID 19. This was kind of a futuristic thing. Of course, they're plugging Jollibee, Jollibee Joy, Chicken Joy. Uh, but what it is saying is that it is expressing really a very important value that is enshrined not only in the church, but here in the Philippines. And that is why sometimes, excuse me, sometimes it is important to take a look at the advertisements and what is the value that they are trying to get across. I remember several years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, no, less than that, maybe 5 6 years ago, when they talk about tourism in the Philippines. This was this scene about a foreigner coming to the Philippines, and the woman who was there was calling him anak, anak, and then the foreigner asked, "What is anak?" Well, in the Philippines, anak means son or child. So in the Philippines, when you come to the Philippines, you become part of the family. That particular kind of what do you call this advertisement is portraying for us a value, a human value that is deeply Filipino or deeply Asian, but at the same time very, very Christian. And that is the kind of thing I think that we need to bear in mind when we talk about the ministry of the church. It has to be something that responds to the culture of the place, something that responds to a pressing need at the moment, and something that lies at the very heart of our current experience. So, so when we look at ministry and we try to root it in the current experience of the people today, we are not discounting the frameworks that we have inherited in regard to to ministry from the past. You know, our forefathers in the Council of Trent, in the Middle Ages, and even in the early fathers of the church, they had their own way of ministering to their contemporaries. But we are also called in the same way also to respond to the needs of our contemporary today. So what is important, of course, is that we be open always to what the world expect we in the church can do for them. Okay, and there is that great expectation. Never mind the people who have discounted already the religious and the ecclesiastical, what the religious and ecclesiastical can do, the influence that it can exert on the rest of society. The people who try to secularize reality or our experience today. But really, whether they like it or not, they really cannot avoid the fact that many of the values that we hold dear as human beings are values precisely that are emphasized also in the church. So being rooted in the world of today. And that is why as I said, when we tried to reframe ministry for the 21st century, I'd like us to be able to not only envision the future, but also envision the future in terms of what we are already experiencing. You know, people who are talking about what is this space exploration, they are not talking about something that is far from happening. It is going to happen. It's going to happen, if not in our own times, in the generation after us. That is going to be a very real thing. So we need to think already along those lines. All right. Now, our ministry is always a Christian ministry because it flows from Christian discipleship. We say ministry, of course, comes as a responsibility when we were baptized. So in baptism, we have been given not only membership in the church, but also at the same time handed over the responsibility of taking care of the people, the same kind of ministry that Jesus himself had embraced. So we embrace ministry because it is part of our responsibility as followers of Jesus Christ. And as disciples of Jesus Christ, then we know exactly the direction, the proper way by which we are to exercise ministry. If we have doubts on whether we are doing it the right way, all we need to do is just go back to Jesus Christ and look to Jesus Christ and his example, and then we will be on the right path. But also, we need to understand that it is Christ's mission principally, and we are only being asked to participate in this mission. Okay. Christ has taken on this mission, and he has taken it on very gladly, and we are being asked to participate or to be his collaborators, to be his cooperators. This is important. Important. Once we realize that it is Christ's mission, then we will be able to know how to deal with problems and difficulties and maybe some failures. Because we know, well, this is really Christ's mission. If we fail at this point, well, Christ will find a way to succeed, for us to succeed in the future. So don't worry, don't be discouraged. Christ will take care of it because it is his mission. As I remember, some people were saying, Lord, I cannot do anything more because I'm already tired, etc. Can you do the rest? And Christ will do the rest. But Christ has empowered us and has privileged us to share in this ministry. I think we should always look at ministry as something that is a great gift, a great privilege, because it is something that is so sublime, a kind of a responsibility. Not everybody in this world are called to participate in the ministry of Jesus, in the mission of Jesus, because we have been baptized, because we have entered the community of the church. Then it has become our privilege to work in the vineyard of the Lord, so to speak, or to work with a good shepherd. So Christ's ministry is very fulfilling indeed, very, very fulfilling. Once you are able to exercise the ministry the way Jesus Christ exercised ministry, then you will find that there is such a great deal of fulfillment in it. It's something that makes us happy, something that gives us meaning in our own existence. Don't what do you call it, underestimate the challenges, however, that will face us, because there are many people who will not probably appreciate this kind of ministry, but at the same time there are many people who do appreciate this kind of ministry. If you have been exposed to mission work, for example, as I have been in South Sudan, it's something that is truly inspiring, because people will never stop giving thanks or being grateful for what you can do, what little bit you can do for them, because it is something that they truly appreciate. Okay. Now, the very fundament of our ministry is the mission of the triune God. and Jesus the Christ, and the church as the sacrament of God's presence today. This is basically what we're talking about when we discuss theological framework of ministry. All right, Globio, please turn off your audio. Okay, so I'd like simply to go back to the very fundament of ministry. We are in fact doing what the triune God had done. So when we say that ministry is something that is uh, that is a participation in the work of in the mission of Jesus, we need to understand that also the very mission of Jesus in itself is an expression of the mission that lies at the heart of the triune God. So ministry is rooted in the mystery of God and God's concern for us and all of the created world. As you will, those of you who have taken up the Trinity, you probably understand this, but in what is called the immanent Trinity, or the Trinity among themselves, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there is that move towards outside of the Trinity, and that is towards the created world, to us, the creatures. And that is what is called the mission of the Trinity. In fact, the incarnation of Jesus Christ is the expression of the mission that the Trinity had felt for the world, for all of created reality. So the triune God's dynamic, the dynamic that occurs between Father, Son, and Spirit, dictates the dynamic in our own ministry. And the dynamic is the dynamic of love at the service of the other. The Father loving the Son, and the Son loving the Father back. And of course, the love that exists between the two of them is cemented in union, that is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit that binds the Father and the Son. The Father is different, and the Son is different, and the love that lies between them is also different, but the difference is one that unites them, a difference that unites them, which is exactly what happens in our own ministry. Because we are all distinct persons, but there is something that binds us together. In our the thing that binds us together, of course, is the triune God, is the mission of Jesus Christ, and of course, is the continuing work of the Spirit today. So when we truly live this dynamic, then this dynamic is a force in itself. And it will be capable of transforming the world itself. That's how strong love is, how powerful love is, because it is all going to change the face of the earth. Again, if the community pantry is not motivated by love, then it would not have been as successful. But because it is motivated by love for the other, for those who need, as well at the same time respectful of the dignity of people who are able to contribute, what little bit they can contribute, then the dynamic itself, you can see how it grows, how it multiplies, how it increases exponentially. And this is the dynamism of the power that love has. And it is this love that exists in the triune God, which we are trying to recreate, of course, in this world. So we are only instruments in the work that God in Jesus Christ and through the constant inspiration of the Spirit accomplishes in our world. So our our responsibility, our mission, our ministry is actually the mission and ministry of the triune God, but we are the instruments of that becoming a reality in our world. Ministry is the responsibility of all. Of course, we're talking about all who, first of all, are baptized, but all who belong to what we call people who believe in God, but also all insofar as all human beings are called towards ministry. Okay, so For us Christians, ministry is very important because it is following or doing ministry according to the way of Jesus himself. Now, for people who are religious and not necessarily Christian, they're probably doing it inspired by some other leader or great person, but it's still something that is a responsibility that they have taken on. Take, for example, the Muslims, even the terrorists, the Muslim terrorists, the suicide bombers, for example. They are doing all of these things because they believe in the cause of their own faith. So, and if we belong to the human family, then of course we're doing it not only for the sake of our own individual family, but for the sake of the family throughout the globe, throughout the world. And of course, there are smaller groups that are formed within the church itself, like what we have there in the picture, the Vincentian family. But ministry is, even if it is a responsibility of everyone, is accomplished in different ways, depending on the talents, the gifts, that we are endowed with, and the devotion and hard work we put into it. So the success of our ministry depends, first of all, on our reliance on God, our faith in God, and especially on the gifts that God has given us, but also on how we make use of the gifts, how we try to use these gifts at the service of love, at the service of the community. So if we look at the ministry as something that we all can participate in, then there is no such thing as a superior ministry. There's only a kind of ministry that has greater responsibility and more exacting demands. Again, depending on your gift or the talent that you are. If you have the gift and talent to be a teacher, then it's going to be more what do you call this? More important or more decisive. Your kind of ministry will be more decisive, precisely because it is going to affect maybe future ministers themselves. Okay. Now, respect for the variety of ministries in the church is also respect for God's marvelous ways of inviting us to participate in God's work. So, when we respect the ministry that we find others are doing, then we are actually acknowledging that it is God Himself who has inspired these ministries. And when we do that, then we don't fall into the trap of envy. We being envious of others or putting down others because maybe they look better or maybe they their kind of ministry is much more attractive. There's no such thing, because when we respect, especially when we are grateful for what we see other people are doing in such a beautiful way, then we are respecting, in fact, the movement of God. Not all of us can be bishops. Not all of us can be presidents, or not all of us can be superiors general or whatever. Not all of us can be as charismatic as Mother Teresa. No, but we have our own nook. Perhaps we have our own niche, and we can do what we can in as best way as we are able. So in that way, we begin to appreciate. And precisely in this way, we make use of ministry in order to build the ecclesial and the human community. So, after all, ministry is always aimed towards the building up of the community, both within the church ad intra as well as in the world at large ad extra. So, ministry cannot be cannot but be for the building up of our church, our community, and of course, our human family. Okay. They always go hand in hand. You can never divorce one from the other. To just say, a ministry, I'm only going to be concerned about the spiritual things, that is not sufficient. That's not sufficient. You have to look at the reality from a much more holistic, integrated perspective. So the positive outlook, however, is important. Failures and occasional derailment are part of life. Live with them and then move on. If things are not as successful, okay, accept it. It's part of life. Then move on. Move on. But always be guided by God's light and love. If we do ministry as authentically motivated as possible, then I believe that we will have that kind of balance that that is the characteristic of people who look at themselves as instruments of God, but who don't take themselves as seriously as sometimes egotists or egoists would do. So if I am not the one to do this, I'm happy that other people can do it. If I am not able to speak up, for example, and take center stage, I'm happy that I will just be there at the backstage, being part of the people in charge of the props. When you are staging a play, for example, the actors are as important as the ones who are helping stage the play or to put the sets on the play or to help in the change of costumes. These are all very important. So but always be guided by God's light and God's love. Because the world is constantly changing, the church's ministry has to adapt itself accordingly. And that is what is so sometimes unpredictable about ministry, because the world will be changing and probably will be changing as uh, as quickly as things change in our own world today. Every age, every generation presents its own set of challenges, and the more we are aware of what these challenges are, and the more we are able to see them not only intimately, in other words, very clearly, right there, here and there, but also look at them from a bigger context, from a wider context. And that is why the historical development of ministry gives us that kind of a wider context, that we will be able to look at ministry not just following what has been the past, but looking at using the past as a kind of a framework with which we can attack a particular situation of ministry today. Although in general, there is really nothing new under the sun, as we say, but the manifestations of certain realities in our own approaches to them will vary and will seek for appropriate and relevant response. If we don't succeed in our first response, try again. There will be other ways. And maybe it's just the way of finding the best solution to a particular reality. For example, we're having problems with vocation recruitment, for example. Let's try to do it. I mean, let's do it. But if things do not work out, let's find another way, other ways. So it's always important to stay open to different possibilities. But the nice thing about us in the ministry in the church today is that we have 2,000 years of experience to depend on. We have that wealth of experience that there is nothing new that can be said as a new area of ministry. It may be new in outwardly, externally, but more than likely it's going to be what you call is pretty much the same. So, for example, in regard to COVID-19, the disease is something new, but the disease as a pandemic is something that has occurred in the world for many, many, many times over. Okay, the plagues, etc., world wars, everything, people suffering in a massive scale, massive scale. This is something that has happened to us. And then what happens? We are brought back to the essential things in life. We are brought back to the more important relationships that we need to foster. Sometimes we have already forgotten those relationships. Maybe it's important that we foster that kind of a relationship again or renew our relationships once more. And this has happened in the experience of COVID for more than 12 months now. We experience something. We come to terms with the perhaps we were too busy looking for job or trying to stay relevant before the pandemic. Now that the pandemic has sort of arrested our what do you call this, our push, arrested our drive towards success, then we are being asked to rethink our priorities. All right. So those are the important points that I believe will be the principles that we need to bear in mind in regard to ministry. Now, in terms of some concluding statements, I'd like to go back to what Gonzalez Faust had written. And I think what he had done was to give us an example of how, in fact, we can do ministry, not only for this generation, but for the next generation, to what we would call the Z generation. Is it the Z generation? No longer the millennial generation? Or the Alpha generation? Is it the Alpha generation now? The children of the millennials? Okay. Now, Gonzalez Faust, an ecclesiologist, or actually a systematic theologian that I respect, he cites a quote from an old article, 1979 article in Le Monde. Le Monde is the Catholic paper in France. And Delumeau writes, "It seems to me that the comparison with the past shows that the present-day crisis of Christianity is unprecedented." Here he's talking about, Christianity becoming less and less influential, or becoming just a kind of a sideshow in a secularist Europe. Hence, the need for the imagination in accessing power in the church and to accept heroic remedies for what, in concrete terms, has to do with Roman power, that is, the invention of new ministries and the total rehabilitation of women. What is he trying to say here? Basically, what this paragraph is saying is that now people, especially in Europe, people look at the church as having not as much influence as it used to have in the past. Of course, that is only an opinion of a limited number of people in Europe, because if you look at the world today, especially if you look at Pope Francis is influencing many, many things in the world today. So in a way, we can say Pope Francis is showing once more the relevance of the church in the world today. But the relevance of the church today, according to the spirit of Francis, is no longer as a power broker, as like one of those big, the other half of the Roman Empire, but as a conscience, so to speak, as a voice that is speaking on behalf of the forgotten people. For example, when we talk about Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si, of course, the whole idea of ecology has been, discussed very, very early on. In the year 2000, and even before the year 2000, we have already spoken about care of creation. And that's very important. But the voice of Pope Francis, when he issued the encyclical Laudato Si, in a way, it had put the ecological concern as a number one priority in the world. And the church had lent its voice to that cause. Because there are still some governments who are denying this the reality of the ecological disaster that's going to take place if we don't watch out. Okay, but the Pope Francis, by taking it up, by taking it in talking about it, has in a way elevated it to a number one principal concern. And now people are paying attention. People people are paying attention. So it is this idea of ministry that Pope Francis is doing that is the kind of ministry that we are looking for. Not again as a power broker, as like a competing what do you call this parallel power to the state or to the world or to the UN, but a voice. Now, speaking about other people, other even in the care of the LGBT, for example, Pope Francis had dared to speak to say that they also need to be considered as members of our human community. So in that way, Pope Francis is using his voice and the influence of the church in order to focus on things that, from our perspective, from the perspective of the church, is not properly attended to, or at least recognized or respected by other sectors of our society. That's the kind of ministry that I think that Dulemo was talking about. Okay, so because we have become so used to the kind of influence the church had, which was connected with Roman power. That's why you have there to accept heroic remedies for what, in concrete terms, has to do with Roman power. Remember the saying, all roads lead to Rome. In other words, Rome is the center of the universe. Uh, Rome is the center of the world. Okay. Now, in a a very different 20th century, that's no longer the case. But there are still some sectors in the church that would like to retain Roman power. And already Pope Francis is trying to chip little by little at this, what we would call the monument of Roman power. For example, talk about the Roman Curia. The Roman Curia is very powerful, especially during the time of John Paul II. The Roman Curia was very powerful. But Pope Francis is trying to limit the role of the Roman Curia and give more power, perhaps more say to episcopal conferences, because they know the situation much more deeply in those different regions of the world. Rome cannot just know all of the cares and concerns of the different continents, the different regional groupings. Rome cannot do that. But when you give the or the episcopal conferences in particular regions more power to decide on certain things, then you are in a way empowering them, because you are giving them that kind of recognition for what they can do on their level. In very important things, necessary things, essential things, okay, you stay united. But on certain things, but there was a time in the past when even the smallest regulation has to be controlled by the Congregation for Divine Worship. Okay, when you sit down, when you genuflect, etc., that's all decreed from the Roman power on high. When things like this are really very dependent on the culture. Genuflecting, for example, is something that we probably are used to already. But in some Asian countries, genuflecting is not as meaningful as just deep bowing. So, really, if a particular Roman Curia were to say you have to genuflect at this point or at that point, it's almost like imposing a culture, one particular culture over another culture. So, but Dolemo has pinpointed basically two areas where the church has to renew its idea of ministry. New ministries. What are the new ministries? In other words, what we call new aeropagai, or new platforms where we can do ministry. And also the rehabilitation of women, basically saying that it's about time that we recognize that women have a power or can contribute a great deal to our ministry. Actually, they already have, but we just do not recognize it officially. And this is basically the role of this particular quotation is trying to say. It's about time that we recognize the role of women. Now, Gonzalez Faust had come up with several statements also that, in a way, summarizes his point. Number one, the church has the freedom to change its ministry. I think what Gonzalez Faust is trying to say here is that he's trying to answer the objection of some people that, we have always known ministry to be in this way and that way. What Gonzalez Faust is saying is that actually, the church had changed its idea of ministry throughout. The 2,000 years of history will tell you that different ways of conceiving ministry was taking place almost at every age, at every turn, in every place. So he emphasizes the conviction that the shape of ecclesial ministry can indeed change profoundly. So what he's saying, do not be afraid. It's going to change. It's something that is a natural occurrence. Natural occurrence. Okay. Because there are some people who keep insisting, oh, you just stick to religious affairs. Just stick to the sacraments, and that's all. You can do ministry. No, it's going to change. Going to change. And what are our reasons, or his reasons for this conviction? Well, the scripture and the tradition has shown this to be true. That it continually changes. Ministry continually changes. And also that the church learns from the reality it faces at a given time. The church learns, but sometimes learns, but waits and waits and waits until things are more assured. But that is the way of the church. So when you talk about women, the ministry of women, we don't know the extent of that kind of ministry yet. But we have to keep trying. We have to keep trying and trying. And before you know it, things just work out. Now, there is a sister who is part of the Synod of Bishops, part of the Secretariat for the Synod of Bishops. That's something new because no woman has ever been part of this select group for the Synod of Bishops. But there is now a sister who is part of it. Little by little, things will come. And I think this is what we need to understand. Changes will take place, but we have to go very, very slowly. And the reason for it is very clear. The reason is that we are a global community. We are a global group. We affect in a global way. But sometimes some of our problems and difficulties are actually territorial. In some cultures, in some regions, you have this. In other regions, you don't have that. So if you just make a kind of a one rule for everybody, good for the whole world, sometimes it may not be applicable in some areas. We need to understand how things work out. Okay. Not everything that has happened in church ministry has been progress or growth. In other words, we have to accept the fact that many times the church also is hit and miss in regard to ministry. Sometimes it hits the target, sometimes it misses the target. Okay. We talk about the Chinese rights controversy, for example. Okay. At the beginning, actually, when we Vincentians went into to China, and we went there in 1699, I think. We went to China in 1699. We were of course armed with the missionary zeal of Europe, going to China, the pagan world of China. We went over there, and of course carried with us our own European culture, and we tried to tell the Chinese this is the way to do it. Whereas there were some other people, among them the Jesuits, who said, well, let's start getting let's start inculturating our faith according to the Chinese culture, according to the Chinese customs. So that is what is called the Chinese rights controversy. The church forbade it at one point and suppressed. In the end, of course, uh, that was dropped, only for it to be revived 300 years later with Vatican II. So it takes time, takes time, sometimes at great pains and sacrificing so many people in the process. But that is, for as long as we are rooted in tradition, in the scripture, and in Christ, then I think we will be steady. We will remain strong. The church has a responsibility for the today of history. I think this is important because we sometimes leave it up to secular rulers, secular leaders to shape the world. But what this conclusion that, and I agree with Gonzalez Faust, the thing is that the church has a strong enough voice to be able to help determine what is best for the world in the future or the world today. Okay. So when the church would speak for or on behalf of poor countries who will be marginalized because they don't have the means to procure the vaccines. So the Pope speaks out and says, please, would we try to make the vaccine available to all people affected by the COVID? Please don't forget the poorer people who cannot afford to have. So what he was trying to say is, you rich countries, don't forget other people. This is a global pandemic. If we don't take care of the poorer people, you can be sure that the pandemic is not going to be stopped. So it is in your own interest that you help them. Now, in this way, what Pope Francis was trying to do was to contribute to the shaping the consciousness of people in regard to how the vaccine could be rolled out. How it could benefit not just the rich but also the poor people. Now, that is a very beautiful way of expressing the role of the church, the ministerial role of the church in regard to the world today. So, the conviction that today the ecclesial ministry must set out not recover its identity by going backwards, but by correctly marching forward. Again, let's not misunderstand Gonzalez Faust when he's saying not by going backwards. Of course, we need to go backwards to learn from the past, but we don't go backwards and imitate the backward, what do you call this, methods of the past. We learn from them and move on, adapt new methods, but we learn from them. Okay, but we do not go back to the time before Galileo. Okay, because that's already been disproven as wrong. Okay, so we need to go beyond Galileo up to now, up to what do you call this, Albert Einstein and company. Now, put forward for this responsibility. There are new developments actually in the church, happening in the church. Stronger solidarity with the poor, more participation by lay people. There is a service-oriented type of leadership, BECs, liberation theology, etc. They are already initiatives that are effective. And modesty aside, the church has initiated many of these things. We talk about the Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations. Well, all of those things were already principles in Catholic Church. In Christianity, those are already principles, not only in the Catholic social teaching, but Catholic social teaching is not new. It's based in the gospel, based in the gospel. But these are things that the people are seeing now as effective. They are effective, and so the church has a voice in the world today. The dramatic changes in the world, the Christianization of the old world, dialogue with Asian religions, return of the churches of the East, etc., call for it. Okay. As I said at the beginning, that we have to take care of the needs of the world today. Focus on the needs of the world today. Okay. And there are many, many serious needs that we need to at least help in finding solutions to. And thirdly, of course, if we want to talk about ecumenism, ecumenism is the program which seeks unity. If we truly believe in God, no matter how we call the God, whether we call the God Yahweh, or we call the God Triune God, or we call the God Allah, and others, when we try to work together, all of us religious work together, we are forging a unity that is surely going to be the basis of the unity of the world. If we can be united among ourselves as religious groups, then what should prevent the rest of the world from being united? We can. We can be united. Third, the church's goal is to pass from tradition to charity. I think we need to explain this. Uh, a lot of times when we organize in the church, especially when we organize ministry, we're so fond of structures. Okay, ordained ministry, different structures, minor steps, and then you have major steps. Minor steps, uh, admission into the clerical state, lector, acolyte, etc., exorcist perhaps, and then ordination to the priesthood, maybe ordination to the episcopacy. Okay. These are all very important. These are structures that are necessary, but we can also modify them. We should not think that these structures are there forever and ever. No, the structures are good for certain occasions and for certain realities and for certain situations. Make use of them. But if they are not as important or as efficient in other places, then by all means modify them, change them. Okay. Now, again, but remember again that the ministry is always service. Service not as a pursuit of power, but power will always be there. You have to understand that power and ministry come together, but depends on how you use power. If you just use power for the sake of pursuing power, then something is wrong there. Okay, you are given a gift. You're given a charisma. More than likely, it will give you a kind of a platform that is unlike other people's platforms. In other words, you have a vantage point, you have a point of influence that is not the same as others. I hear millennial people talk about influencers. I am an influencer. I don't know exactly the full connotation of that word, but being an influencer. But that comes with charism. If you have a particular talent, you have innate power right there. Okay, but so understandable that from with charism comes also power. But when we use our post, the influence, the status, our status, to launch a career, okay, according to Gonzalez Faust, we should avoid that kind of a temptation. Because once we make it a career, then it becomes a career. It becomes a status that oftentimes we do not want to get out of. We would like to remain there because it is a seat of influence, the seat of power. And so we make a career out of our ministry. Okay. Now, the other thing that needs to be avoided, of course, is from a career, we make it sacred. Ah, you are a minister. You serve the community. Okay. So you have a special talent. Also, we put you in a pedestal because you're able to influence. We want to see you. We want to imitate you. Okay, because you are doing something very, very good. When you start imitating somebody, that somebody will probably just take care of itself, how he is perceived by others. It becomes a career. But worse is still when is considered as that is given by God. That God has ordained you to be the king of this world. And that is what many people have said or mentioned about in connection with the divine right of kings. There was a time when the monarchs of Europe considered themselves as king because God has appointed them kings and queens. That's no longer the case now. But there was a time when they connected kingship with divine entitlement. So I'm close to God. You better pay attention to what I'm going to say. If I don't like you, I can just get rid of you. I can do it. And because I come from God, because God has ordained me, then I I can do I can do it in the name of God even. Now that becomes extreme. We have to understand that for the ordained ministers, this is the biggest temptation. I am not saying that ordination is wrong. No, ordination is good. Ordination is basically a recognition on the part of the church that this particular person is being called to a role of leadership. That is basically what it is. It's a recognition that God is ultimately the one responsible for calling you. But it doesn't mean that just because you are called by God, that you are God. Okay? But there were times in the past when people who were precisely members of the ordained ministry considered themselves as so high, so noble, and so kingly that they cannot be questioned, that they cannot be contradicted, because that would be tantamount to criticizing or contradicting God. When that happens, you have another God. So we have made of ourselves God. But it is good to remind ourselves that we need to move towards something much more basic in regard to ministry. The church has to move from tradition to charity. This was the theme of the 2004 Congress of the Consecrated Life, of the International Congress on Consecrated Life, Passion for Christ and passion for humanity. There are issues and problems that need to be resolved. Okay. Again, we continue to have problems. The church is for the masses or for the select minority. Sometimes we in the church, especially we in the ordained ministry, we sometimes give too much attention and too much favor to the few who are very active in the parish, in the community, because they help financially, or they're always there helping in the parish, of course. If they are helping, we're happy. But how about the majority, those who are not even going to church? What is our ministry towards them? So we are led to ask, is the church only for the small group, or is it a church for the big group? I mean, for everybody, for everybody. So that would be one issue and one problem that we need to address. Okay. And again, it's very easy for us to fall right into the trap of just taking care of those people who come to church, who attend maybe parish meetings, etc., or who attend parish programs, etc. But we don't worry about the others who are outside, somewhere else. Okay. Then also the issue about the universal and the local church. The problem is not so much on what is this on the local church. I think the local church we tend to be rather defensive about our being a local church. We would like to be clear that we should be recognized as a local church. But sometimes it is the so-called universal church imposing itself on the local church. What I mean by that is that, for example, a European local church, under the guise of being the center of Christianity, like Rome, center of Christianity, imposes itself on the local church in ways that are not culturally acceptable to the local culture. Now, this is a problem. This is an issue between the universal and the local. The universal, the truly universal, is found in every local church. But the truly universal are things that are essential things that unite us all, whether we live in Timbuktu or whether we live in Tawi-Tawi or whether we live in Galapagos Island or in the Alaska or in New York. So we need to be precise about our own understanding of the local church and the universal church. And then the idea of koinonia, meaning communion in life and in the mission. Some people were saying, let's just talk about our own life as a community, as Catholic Church. Let's not worry about other things that do not belong to the Catholic Church. Let's not worry about the poverty of in places that are what we would call pagan territories. That's not our concern. That is an important question that we need to keep addressing. The unity of the two. Our communion with everybody. At the same time, the mission that we are called to do, not just for people within the church, but also outside of the church. And then the tension between what we know as the historical church, both the past as well as the present church today, but also the church that's going to come in the future, eschatological. Our sight is always towards the future, but we live in the present. But always the present in the perspective of the future. So the parousia, in a way, the final days, the eschaton, needs to be something that defines our living of the present. And that is why we talk about reframing ministry for the 21st century. I don't think the parousia is going to come at the end of the 21st century. No, I think there's still a long way to go. But we need to always keep projecting towards the future, because ultimately that means our recapitulation, our unification as all of humanity, all of created reality in Christ. And then presidency of the Eucharist. in relation to presidency of the community. We have already seen that in the early church, the two are not the same. The one who is president of the Eucharist is not necessarily the president of the community. But there came a time when the two were joined together. The two roles were joined together. So the presidency, for example, of the Eucharist, or what we call the breaking of the bread, or what we call the presidency at the fellowship meal, was something distinct to what we would call the presidency of one who is like the coordinator of the community. The coordinator of the community takes care of the business of the community, etc. But to lead a prayer, to lead the celebration of the Eucharist, it was another person. Sometimes, yes, it's the same person who does that. Eventually, however, the two were put together so that we now speak about ordained ministry, who is not only the leader of the community, as far official leader of the community, the church community, but also the presider of the Eucharist. Because the Eucharist is the finest expression of the community itself. Okay, so that is something that we need to work on. Then factual plurality in the uniform church today. In other words, whether we deny it or not, or whether we accept it or not, the factual plurality is something that is obvious and something that is a reality. There are just many different ways of looking at mission, looking at the church, what the church is, looking at what we can do for others. There are many different ways. So plurality. But there are still some sectors in the church that would look at our way of doing things as in a more uniform way. If you say the mass in this way in Rome, it should be the same mass in other places. Otherwise, how can we call it Roman mass if it doesn't follow the uniform what do you call this liturgy of the Roman mass? So the tendency there of uniformity and plurality, as opposed to plurality or pluralism. These are things that we need to continually have to deal with. There's a tension in these things, but it's a creative tension. It's a tension that makes us even better. In terms of roads to open, and this I think the suggestions are quite important from Gonzalez Faust. Bring real ministry to official ministry. When we talk about women, for example, women ministry in the church, whether we like it or not, women have done all kinds of ministry, but they have not been recognized officially. And that is the point here. When you are doing real ministry, why shouldn't you be recognized as official minister? What Pope Francis again had done, for example, recently, was that the catechists who are doing a lot of work already in the parishes, and in the case of the U.S., for example, the catechists work very, and in the case in Africa, oh my God, the catechists are more important than the parish priest sometimes, because in the absence of the parish priest, because there are not too many priests, in the absence of the parish priest, it is the catechists who keep the faith, not only teach the young ones the faith, the essentials of the faith, but who maintains the community. It's very, very strong. The role of the catechist in Africa is very, very strong. There are thousands and thousands of catechists in in South Sudan. And that is why Pope Francis had recognized them as real ministers. So in a way, what Francis had done was simply to recognize officially this ministry as real ministry. In other words, it's not something that is just, uh, a part-time job or what I call is, well, it's a nice thing to have, but it's not, no, it's an important thing. All right. But the approach of communion, being united, even as we recognize ourselves to be plural, this is, I think, a very important approach, as we have already explained previously. Again, another thing that we need to bear in mind is that we are more missionary oriented. In other words, sharing our message with the rest of the world, with people who have not heard about Jesus, about the message of love. We need to be more missionary rather than be more inward directed. Let's cultivate, let's work on our own parish and just cultivate our own group. And okay, you start from there. You start from there. But then necessarily, if you follow the Trinity, necessarily you will have to get out of yourself. You have to extend yourself to others because that's the only way you can find fulfillment in what you are doing when you start sharing it with others. But in order to do this, you need to discern, and discern. And then finally, Gonzalez Faust offers a kind of an important item on spirituality. Spirituality of surrender, he calls it. Well, why is it the spirituality of surrender? Because it's a spirituality of dedication and commitment. So by dedicating oneself to the life and mission of the community to the point of emptying oneself of the ecclesiastical image. Sometimes because we wear sutana, because we wear a habit, or because we have privileged places in the places of worship. We have a throne sometimes, so we are very distinct. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes, what is this, do not realize that the one person whom we are giving witness to is hanging on the cross, emptying himself. Whereas we're so full of ourselves, we're so full of our power, of our ambition, of our privileged status. And here comes Jesus telling us, ministry is giving up yourself, putting the community ahead of everybody else, putting the love for the community above the love for or your own group, for your own advancement, for your own congregation. You have to love the community. But that means, or that implies sacrifice on your part. Gonzalez Faust says the service, we should be careful that the service of the altar or the service to the necessary bureaucracy do not substitute in any way the service to the community. Community of, what did I say? Now, what he's trying to say here is that the service of the altar is important, right? Somebody has to preside at the Eucharist. That is basically what it means. But service to the necessary bureaucracy, somebody has to be a parish priest. Somebody has to be a leader. Somebody has to be a bishop. That's also a service. So service as the presider at the Eucharist, service also as the leader, maybe as a financial manager, that's also service. But don't let that substitute the service that you render to the community. The community that you are called to serve. Always remember that the service is always a service for of the community. The spirituality of surrender also does not show itself only in personal happiness. In other words, that you are all concerned about your own spiritual, your own advancement, your own perfection, your own holiness. But we can also understand this, that the spirituality of surrender is even more expressed in the exercise of inevitable authority. And what is recognized as inevitable authority? If you are chosen as a leader, you have authority. Authority is placed upon your shoulders. But authority is going to be both to be used for the community. But as you use authority for the community, know that it will not be easy, because there will be others, there will be some who will question your authority. So if you are given authority, be ready to accept people who will question your authority. Okay. And sometimes you just have to accept the fact that sometimes you are wrong. Even as persons in authority, we are wrong. And we have to accept it. It's part of the burden of authority. But if you're really authentically uh, exercising your leadership and your authority, then we see the what do you call this, the contradiction of your people under you, or people you're collaborating with, as something that is normal. I don't hold it against this person personally. No, he is questioning my authority, and I respect him for that. He's questioning my authority. It's telling me I better take a second look, or a third look, or a fourth look at the way I exercise my authority. In fact, he is doing me a favor by asking me to rethink and rethink and rethink whether I am doing it the right way. So it's a service. But if you are not humble enough to be able to accept the corrections of your converts, or the people who are your subjects, so to speak, then you will find it very difficult. Then you will find that the exercise of authority can only be exercised in one way: imposing yourself on others, which is the opposite of what real authority in the light of Jesus and the example of Jesus on the cross. So, following Jesus and Paul, we forget our own selves so as to be able to focus on others. A person who has the authority, a person who has the leader, will always uh, focus not on the hurts that he feels. Of course, those are human things, but he will not dwell on those hurts. Rather, he would dwell on what is better for the community. Okay, they don't accept my idea, but what is better for the community? Oh. At the same time, and I think this is a beautiful quote from Corinthians, from Paul. At the same time, we exercise ministry in such a way so as not to become a burden to others. You know, a beautiful thing, that a very humble way of saying, I would like to exercise authority, but I don't want to be a burden to you. I will do my part. If you do not understand the way I'm doing things, okay, I will be exercise patient with you. But also, I do not want to be a burden to you. I don't want to be an obstacle to your to something bigger, something greater. And when you do that, you're actually placing yourself in the hands of God, in the hands of the Spirit. And you exercise authority in a way that is going to be so much, so much more satisfying, because you know your concern is not yourself. Your concern is not even your own opinion. Your concern is the community itself. And then you're able to live with yourself as well as live with members of the community. And this is where we end our synthesis and conclusions.